On behalf of the Urban Institute and our friends at Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy, we want to thank everyone for joining us today for this webinar on centering racial equity in data use. We are excited to share the resources that we've developed to offer a way to frame equitable data practice and offer examples of how to center racial equity in data use and integration. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Urban Institute, we are a nonprofit social and economic policy research organization located in Washington, D.C. Here at the Urban Institute, my colleagues and I are dedicated to providing data and evidence to drive solutions that improve people's lives, promote equity, and strengthen communities. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started today. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted online afterward. The slides are also available online on the event page for the webinar. All participants are muted. And finally, please feel free to type your questions and comments into the Q&A box at any time. And now, I'm going to kick it over to Sue.
Good afternoon, everybody. Great to have you on the webinar. We'd like to start with a question to see what's going on out there in the world. So the question is, what are you doing to center racial justice and equity in your work and in your organization right now? So if you would share some of the work, some of the ideas that you all are implementing now. Amy Hahn-Nelson will take a few minutes to highlight a few of those before we begin our presentation.
Hi, everybody. I am Amy Hahn-Nelson, Director of Training and Technical Assistance for Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy. We're thrilled to have you here today. Please take this time to drop in the chat box. What are you doing to further racial justice and racial equity across data use in your organization? All right, we have reviewing policies, excellent, funding, disaggregating data across subgroups, intentionality around problems and solutions and discussing those, excellent. Hope everyone's able to monitor the chat box right now. There's so many great ones, I can't even say them all. All right, rethinking research methods. That's a critical piece of the toolkit you'll hear about in a few moments. Excellent. Looking at a racial equity inclusion lens for every policy issue that is considered. Looking at intersectionality. Love it. Looks like we have all kinds of sectors represented. I see a wildlife conservation comment. I don't get to hang out with wildlife conservation people very often. Excellent. All right, these are fantastic, and there are more of them than I can even talk about. Thank you so much for sharing. Please take a moment to drop these in. Excellent. Developing guidelines, looking at differential impact. All right, everyone. I'm going to turn it back over to Sue for some framing.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Amy. And thank you, everyone, for sharing what's happening in your community. This is a process where we are all learning together. And so taking these opportunities to really integrate our learnings will hopefully advance the sector. My name is Sue Gallagher, and I work at the Children's Services Council in Broward County. And I am the Chief Innovation Officer working with our integrated data system, as well as our racial equity initiatives and countywide strategic planning. Next slide. So today we have the opportunity to hear from two national organizations that in some cases share a community. The communities are working with both entities to advance data systems and data use. And both entities have a shared commitment to equitable data systems and use. So we're really bringing together some powerhouse organizations to help us think and learn together more deeply what does equity and equitable data use and equitable data systems look like. Next slide. Here in Broward County, home to Fort Lauderdale, we are a county of almost 2 million people, over 400,000 children, and we have been partnering with AISP through their technical assistance program to learn how to build an integrated data system. And in our 18-month technical assistance process with them, we learned governance, research, technology, and legal agreements, but we also had this nagging sense that we needed to be more intentional and thinking about how does equity look when we build these systems. And so we have been a catalyst and a companion on the journey with AISP to really create more equitable data system structures. And I'll show you kind of how we got to that place. So next slide. As in all communities, I think probably represented on this call, when we look at our data in a disaggregated fashion, we see the same racialized pattern: white on top, black on the bottom, and brown somewhere in the middle. Every sector is showing this racial disparity data. And what we've learned on our journey is that it's not enough just to see this data, because our cognitions will take us to, well, why didn't people make a different decision? Well, why aren't they doing better as individuals? And what we've recognized is that these data sets are really created by racist structures in all sectors of our community, in education, in healthcare, in justice, and in economics. And so how do we begin to understand what those structures and systems are that are actively producing these racially disparate results, and what are the implications of that for using data and building data systems? Next slide. So in our community, my colleague and I, Michelle Higgs, have provided training to over 3,500 folks for us to understand what is this structure of racism and how does it show up in our local community. If you could advance through this slide, there are a couple of columns that come up. And what we do in our training, it's usually a half-day training, is we talk about 400 years of racism in 4 minutes. And you may think, wow, well, how can you do that? Because the pattern of racism is consistent across time. It changes language, it changes words, but it really is the same pattern. And so what you see here is that racism is embedded in the laws and the policies, right? And because those laws and policies are inequitable, it takes violence to maintain them. So the violence of slavery, lynching, police brutality, those are the mechanisms through which these inequitable laws, policies, and structures are in place. And all of those come with a social narrative, right? That allows people to sleep at night when the social inequitable system is so entrenched and causing so much harm and violence. And we also see that across the centuries in the United States, parts of us have recognized that this system is inequitable and we have to do better. Today, we are in the version of racism that is race neutral. So many of us were raised to be colorblind. That is a direct result of race neutral policies like the war on crime and the war on poverty, where nowhere it said we discriminate against Black and brown folks, but the implications and the outcomes of those policies was to provide disparate outcomes and disparate treatment. Next slide. It's also been very important for us to understand the local context in which we are using data and where that data comes from, and what some of the historical patterns are that generate this data. So we've created a one-page history in Broward County showing the educational, health, economic, and justice disparate treatments of Blacks and whites in our community. Most of us in Broward County are immigrants from other parts of the United States or other parts of the world. And we have no idea how that history has set up the needs and the strategies and the structures that we see today. And so what we've said here in Broward County is that our communities have not yet recovered from Jim Crow. Next slide. So when we look at the data of where our historically Black communities were created under Jim Crow, we see in the South County, it was created in 1940 by white developers to bring Black agriculture and domestic workers up to Broward from Miami. Northwest Fort Lauderdale was another community created by eminent domain. And then up at the top of the county is Collier City, which was home to Black agricultural workers. Today, when we look at where are the highest needs and the lowest resources, we still see them layered on top of those historically Black communities. And so understanding the historical and geographic and spatial segregation that racism continues to perpetuate has to inform how we're using data and how we're thinking about it and who we're partnering with to understand that. Next slide. And so what we've seen is that racism shows up in the use of data and the development of data systems. You know, it was an interesting observation that I shared with Amy and many of our colleagues when we were in the technical assistance rooms learning how to build the data systems, that the rooms were predominantly white, that the researchers, the technology folks are predominantly white. And yet we know here in Broward County, the majority of people whose data are in the systems are people of color. And so the system has a systematic racialized hierarchy already built in. And how can we intentionally begin to reimagine and redesign data systems and data use that doesn't replicate that racialized hierarchy? Another way that the racism shows up in data systems and data uses, you've got researchers and policymakers, right, who are using the data, but who are socially and spatially segregated from people from people whose data is in the system, right? That has real implications for how the data gets used, gets understood, what questions are asked of it, what assumptions are made of it. And so what are the ways that we can collapse that segregation, where we can integrate the experience of people whose data is in the system with researchers and policymakers and funders around this use, right? And then the last way that structural and historical racism shows up is through this justifying narrative. Think about how we talk about people whose data is in the system: at risk, underserved, marginalized, right? It's language that continues to separate and create hierarchy. And so how do we create a new narrative around data use? And this typology, this way of seeing racism in data systems is very helpful for us in beginning to think, how can we reimagine the use of data and the creation of data systems? Next slide. And so we've begun to really understand what are some of the ways that we can design anti-racist data system. And one of the primary ones is shared decision-making. How do we create mechanisms and structures to support the decision-making of people whose data is in the system, or people who may be affected most directly by those data decisions, right? What kind of tables can we set in order to more equitably use and deploy data? And then who's funding? And I'll give you a very simple example. So we fund researchers. Policymakers have a salary, but how are we funding people whose data is in the system to sit at the table? Are they consultants? Are they co-researchers? Are they being paid? Are we providing training, capacity building, and support so that they actually can bring their expertise to the table? Those are some of the questions that we've been asking. In addition, because we understand that there's a segregation, there is a hierarchy, what spaces can we create where it's not a service hierarchical relationship, where it's two human beings living in a community who want to do better for themselves, for their families, for their neighbors, right? How are we creating spaces where it's not driven by this data hierarchy or by this service hierarchy? And then the last challenge that we have is really considering how are we telling the story about what data tells us what's in the data, and what data can do for us. What we have found in our experience around this is that we tell very dehumanizing stories, you know, that people don't have the skills, the expertise, they only have needs, we only see them as a risk factor. And so how are we beginning to tell a different story? And how does our use of data systems and our use of data promote more humanizing stories? And what does that really look like? And I think some of the things that you're going to hear this afternoon will lend themselves to really more opportunities to create those humanizing stories and a focus on the context rather than just blaming the individuals. And so, next slide. So what we've done, in addition to being a catalyst with the AISP and the toolkit that we've developed together, is that we're also going to share with you our work in action. And what we've done in Broward County is we've created what we call community participatory action research, where young people whose data is in the system, whether it's from juvenile justice system, child welfare system, education system, behavioral health system, that we've engaged people in a critical process that looks at power, that raises voice and authority. Specifically, we've worked with folks out of CUNY, the Public Science Project, who have facilitated the work between system participants, the youth, as well as system professionals, whether it's the therapist, could be investigators, child welfare investigators, to be co-researchers together. And it has been a transformative process where we have gotten to know each other as human beings, where we value each other's contributions at a more equitable level, where we ask and interrogate questions together from our multiple perspectives. And this we are continuing to evolve as an equitable structure as part of our data system and our data usage here in Broward County. And so this is just one example of a work in progress that we're learning a lot about how can we co-create equity in our data systems and in our data usage. And so I hope that this has sort of provided some of the ways for you to think about how do we contextualize the use of data, the building of data systems, and what ways might we begin to innovate data systems and data systems use. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague at the Urban League, Leah Hendry, to talk about how they're working that out at the Urban Institute.
Great, thank you, Sue. I know we're all looking forward to seeing what you all are doing in Broward County and learning more from the model that you're pulling together. Hello, everyone. I'm Leah Hendy, a Principal Research Associate at the Urban Institute and the co-director of the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership. I just want to start first by thanking the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for their support of our project Elevate Data for Equity. If we can go to the first slide. This project stems out of our experience of coordinating the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership over the last 2 decades, and what we've learned about what it means for a community to have data capacity. Our partners are all working to make sure communities have access to data and to the skills to use information to advance equity and well-being across neighborhoods. These organizations are serving as data translators, navigators, educators, conveners, and collaborators, helping to build community data capacity and apply the data to achieve impact. We do believe that data are a powerful tool that can be used by communities to tackle ambitious goals like advancing racial justice or increasing economic mobility. But there is an overall shortage and an unequal distribution of data capacity that needs to be addressed. And everyone needs to take a deep look into how we are using our data in our own work and in service to others. For today's webinar, I'm going to focus on one of the major products from our Elevate Data for Equity project, the brief that my colleagues Marcus Gaddy and Cassie Scott wrote on principles for advancing equitable data practice. Next slide. As researchers, even in social science and economics, we've been trained to follow the scientific process. There's really a focus on objectivity and on rigor. And at the Urban Institute, we do believe that policy decisions can be shaped by facts and evidence and less about ideology. But objectivity is not a passive activity. As the president of the Urban Institute, Sarah Rosenwortel, recently put it, It means, and sorry, I think I just lost my video for a second, but assuming you all can still hear me.
Yes, we can hear
It
you.
means, okay, that investigating long-held assumptions, tackling root causes, and listening to and taking guidance from new voices, ceding some authority to other forms of expertise, and seeing evidence and lived experiences as well as numerical data. Objectivity requires that we name racism when we see it. In NNIP over the past few years, we've been reflecting on what it means to be an objective and trusted data partner in communities. And what we've really come to understand is that we need to acknowledge that data aren't neutral. Data can be applied, can be used as a tool, but they need to be questioned, explored, and intentionally applied. Data are created and understood through a process that involves numerous decisions. What questions should be asked? What methods should be used to collect the data? How are the data analyzed? How are they interpreted and shared? All of these decisions reflect the interests, assumptions, and biases of the people involved. Next slide. We have ample evidence that data have been used and misused to harm people and communities. Some harmful uses of data are more clear, like historical redlining practices, but others, like the stigmatization of neighborhoods that occurs through constantly labeling them as high poverty, high violent crime, and poor educational opportunities, is less obvious, but still damaging. These impressions of communities change how people view them and what policy responses and investments are directed to them. Research institutions and government have typically turned to institutional review boards or IRBs to provide oversight to protect people involved in formal research studies. But these IRBs are focused primarily on research that involves direct interaction between people and researchers and on individual versus collective harms. Research conducted with secondary data, especially if it's aggregated, is typically exempt from review. Moreover, much data collection and analysis takes place in organizations without their own IRBs. We need to expand the thinking behind IRBs, which is to take a pause to intentionally explore whether our research and analysis provide benefits to people and communities. The principles that the IRB follows, the seminal Belmont report, can be used to frame our thinking, to put communities and people identified in the data at the center of our data practice throughout all stages of the data lifecycle. We need general principles in addition to point-in-time rules because the specific context does matter for decisions in using data, and there can't be rules to cover every situation, especially with so many changes happening in the world and in data and technology. Next slide. These principles can guide actions in a wide variety of contexts. Beneficence is about committing to maximizing the benefits and minimizing the harm, even if there's not a formal or legal requirement. We should all be considering the risk and benefits together. Do people bearing the risk actually benefit from the work? Respect for persons, a lot can be improved to incorporate this in our data practice, to elevate respect for persons in the process, to make sure that we are recognizing people's power to own their own data and to make decisions about it, and protecting those who cannot exercise that power. Justice is about committing to a fair distribution of burdens and benefits. Often research done in communities fails to return any benefits to those who have shared their data, their time, and their lived experience. Next slide. My colleagues organized the brief around the data lifecycle, identifying examples of principle-aligned practices in each phase and resources you could use to learn more. Part of what we are hoping that this brief will accomplish is for people working with all types of data to think about how they can incorporate these principles when they are collecting, using, and sharing data. This includes administrative records derived from the operations of government agencies, nonprofits, or businesses, derive statistics from things like the American Community Survey or other census products, or even qualitative information collected in focus groups and interviews. Next slide. One example of a justice line practice in the dissemination phase that we highlight in the brief is to return data and research results to the community in a form that they can use. To do so could take many different forms. The resource we connect to in the brief is Chicago Beyond's fantastic guidebook, Why Am I Being Researched?, which asks researchers to reflect on whether the language they are using is accessible and to reflect on the format and forums in which they're sharing results to see which would be most appropriate to return the results to the community. As one example of this, our NNIP partner in Milwaukee, Data You Can Use, worked with neighbors in their community to return the results of a community survey by creating infographics that were shared through a door hanger that they distributed around the neighborhood, and through large-scale displays for people who lived in the neighborhood to be the ones presenting the findings to other neighbors at events. Next slide. Even if you aren't engaged directly in collecting data and information from people, you do have a duty to use and manage data responsibly and ethically. Everyone involved in data collection and use, from the leadership to the end users, no matter what sector, should consider these principles and how they align with their data practices. And on the last slide, we've provided a couple of links to the brief. And in addition to that, our website, Elevate Data for Equity, links to a set of resources around equitable data practice for your reference as you're thinking about how to change your data practices. And I'm going to pass it off to Bridget.
Thank you so much, Leah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bridget Blount, and I am the Senior Director of Data Initiatives for Baltimore's Promise. We are a collective impact nonprofit located in Baltimore, Maryland. I am so really excited to be here with you all today, along with the other panelists, to discuss a resource that was recently released by the Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy. This is the toolkit that really provides partners and data collaboratives the skills and some tools on how to center racial equity in data use. As Sue mentioned, Baltimore's Promise became a member of the second cohort, learning cohort for the Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy learning cohort in 2018. When we came in with our partners, representatives from the city of Baltimore and Baltimore City Public Schools, all we knew is that we wanted to build an integrated data system that centered equity and that included community voice in the governance process and decision making. And so during our 18 months of technical assistance with AISP, we received so many resources and so much guidance around technical infrastructure, data modeling, governance and legal frameworks and agreements. But what wasn't explicitly offered during this time, because it just wasn't available, was how do actual organizations that want to center equity throughout both the development of the infrastructure as well as data use do this. And so I am so excited to now be able to talk about this resource that AISP has now spearheaded through working with a diverse group of stakeholders that included both equity and community advocates, nonprofit organizations and service providers, and staff representing different state and local government agencies also working to integrate data. I would like to say I am by far not an expert in this subject, but in developing or working to develop the Baltimore integrated data system, I am on a journey, and that we have been working with consultants to ensure that the work that we're doing is both in community informed and race and embeds race equity. And so I am excited that this toolkit now will provide others interested in this journey a starting point or tools to improve some of their current practices. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. As I mentioned before, this process really began about 3 years ago. with AISP. And as you can see, like in 2017, it was just a really sites that were doing amazing work integrating data. But when you came into the rooms and you asked questions, well, where's community? And how does this work really include those who are in the data? Those types of questions were new. And so it generated a lot of excitement and thought into how we can kind of create tools for others to be able to answer these questions. Next slide. You can keep going on this slide. So basically, governments and nonprofit organizations are collecting data and are collecting a vast amount of data, more data than we've collected any other point in history. And it's an exciting time because this data is used to inform policy and program interventions for those to improve outcomes for our most vulnerable communities. This is an improvement on where we have been using the way that we were developing program interventions previously. Oftentimes they were done based off of hunches or whichever the community was the loudest, or doing it just because those were the things that we were doing. But it's important that we take a step back while data can provide us and inform our program interventions and identify effective programming. It's important that we are also not relying solely on that data to tell us the full story. It is not data alone does not give us a community perspective on why the data is saying what it's saying. It does not reflect lived experiences, nor does it provide a historical and social political kind of context into how outcomes have manifested. And so with this understanding, next slide. With this understanding, it is important that that community is involved at every step. One matter that's put forth in a toolkit is really this idea around the development and innovation of railroads and highways. When railroads and highways were developed in the 1800s and 1900s, these were tools, these were ways of innovative ways that really improved the life circumstances for some individuals and communities. At the same time, some communities were harmed and displaced and never fully repaired from the development of these railroads and highways. And so we are at a critical time where data infrastructure can play a role in illuminating where there are inequities and or we can the only alienation to different communities. Next slide, please. So the question here is, where do we need to center equity? Awesome. So the question here is, where do we need to center equity? Please, next slide. And as you can guess, the answer is throughout each stage of the data lifecycle. When we're talking about planning, from planning to who's at the table, data collection, understanding that using especially administrative data, that we are reusing data that was collected for the purposes of service operation. And so sometimes data are not appropriately documented to changes and calculations. And so basically understanding how getting information from the service providers and staff members on changes to the data is imperative through data access. And so it's important through reporting and dissemination where we have the data and data that we're including community members in order to understand what the information that we're seeing so that we're not misinterpreting it. Next slide. To successfully do this work, it is encouraged, the toolkit definitely encourages, and this is the work that we do, is that we're creating participatory governance models. And what this means is that we're sharing the decision-making processes about what data is used, what data is accessed, and ultimately the information that we want to look at. So what are the needs that we want to address, that we're sharing, that service providers and systems are piloting and sharing process with the members. In addition, it is definitely true, just because something legal does not mean it's ethical to do. So it is that we offer process where we include And so what it means is that we don't go to the community and say, this is what we're going to do. The community and say, hello. Okay. So that we ensure that that we've gone to community and understand what outcomes they're interested in.
Hey, Bridget, we're having trouble hearing you. Can you try to come in via your phone?
Yes.
And we'll pause. And I can talk through this slide for everyone. All right. Hi, everyone. As Bridget gets on a different audio link. So here we have right here a benefit risk matrix. So the idea from the toolkit around this is that there's no data sharing and integration that's inherently unequal or anything that inherently shouldn't be done. Instead, it's a series of decisions, right? So generally speaking, work group participants were in agreement that if a data integration, data access and use project was high value or high benefit and low risk, then great, it should be done. So NNIP is an excellent example of that. National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership. The sites that are a part of NNIP do a lot of this work, right? A lot of mapping of indicators, a lot of supporting program evaluations. There's a lot of high benefit, low risk activity there. In contrast, things that are high risk and low benefit, generally speaking, not probably a great idea. And the general consensus of the work group was that those things should be very carefully considered and only with really strong community voice as a part of it. And in some cases, just maybe should be stopped fully. So that is what this benefit risk matrix is talking about. And then there's a lot of in between, right? There's a lot of things that just have to be carefully considered. And that's more kind of the yellow that you see here. All right, Bridget, are you back on? All right, if not, we can get to the next slide and I can. All right, here we have a kind of a similar construct where we, a huge piece of centering racial equity is deciding what should be open data, what should be restricted data, that only credentialed users should have access to, and then some things that probably just shouldn't be available. And this varies quite a bit, and it can vary for different reasons. So sometimes the reason for unavailable data is just it's not available because it's paper copies or it's not a machine readable format. Sometimes there are technical limitations, and then sometimes there are legal limitations as well, statutes, rules, regulations, things like that. And then there's some that just shouldn't be shared ethically. In some communities, for example, like domestic violence data, that's a good example of just data that's unavailable in many places. For this work in particular, the open data is one that has to be carefully considered. And we go into that quite a bit within the toolkit. And it looks like Bridget's connected, so I'm gonna turn it back over. Bridget, are you good? Awesome, okay, I'm going away now. Oh, you're muted, Bridget. Unmute yourself.
Hello?
You're good, but you might need to mute your computer now because you probably have audio going through 2 different streams.
Okay. No.
Nope. Almost there, we're so close.
You'll need to click the bottom of your screen, click the arrow, and click Leave Computer Audio. By the mute button, there's a little arrow. Click that arrow and then click Leave Computer Audio. And now we don't have any audio from you, unfortunately. If you're connected by your cell phone, if you wouldn't mind sending me your cell phone number in the chat, I can allow your cell phone to talk. Just chat that privately to me.
All right, y'all, while we're figuring that out, I will go ahead and do the rest of the slide. So the data classification matrix is a part of this work of figuring out equity, right? We have to see, what data should be open data, what data is restricted or unavailable, and figure that out with an equity lens. So a really good example of this that's featured in the toolkit is a lot of what people call the criminal justice data. I typically call it injustice data. But that type of data is in a lot of communities, for example, my community is incredibly open. And to me, in my perspective, some of the data probably shouldn't be open. So there's different perspectives of this, of whether data should be open or restricted. And a lot of that is really community context rather than a hard or fast rule. So generally speaking, the work group agreed that all of this should be a series of conversations with a lot of different stakeholders and community members, and not necessarily like a binary yes or no. These things are rarely either good or either bad, and usually a whole lot of gray. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Bridget again.
Okay, I think that we have this figured out. Thanks so much for working with me through my technical difficulties. Okay, so we can go to the next slide, and I'm going to go through these quickly because we really want to get to kind of questions and answers. And so the toolkit is really set up in a really nice structure where it offers so based on the different stages of data use, it offers promising positive practices as well as problematic practices for each stage. And so if you're looking at like the planning stage, for example, it includes some positive practices are around including diverse stakeholders, ensuring that researchers and community as well as service providers are all at the table to collaboratively come up with agenda setting as well as research priorities. So oftentimes we'll come to community, as I mentioned before, and say this is what we want to do, and not going to community and really say, well, these are what we're seeing. What are some of the reasons that you think that these things are happening, and how can we address this issue in a collaborative way? And so the toolkit really provides kind of best practices for each stage of the life cycle. And then following this, each stage of the description of best practices, next slide. The toolkit offers works in action. And so for me, this is where you really get into, really get a deep dive into figuring out how your organization in particular can kind of do this work. Oftentimes it's more theoretical, like, oh, we bring people to the table, but how do you bring people to the table? And what were some of those challenges in that process? Because a lot of times community members as well as systems have to repair trust before they can work together. And work together in a way that's most efficient to improving outcomes. And so the toolkit really provides examples and exemplars of different jurisdictions who have successfully been able to implement some of the best practices identified through each stage of the data lifecycle. And what is key here is that, again, as I mentioned before, that we're all on a journey together. And so some of these examples have been completed, and then some of them are still in process. And so it just really gives us a nice glimpse into how we could potentially do this work. Next slide, please. And then following the description of best practices and problematic practices for each stage of the data lifecycle to embed race equity. There again, as I mentioned, the works in action. And then when you're trying to figure out, okay, well then how can I do this work? So I understand what are some good practices around it, and I see how other people have done it, and now I'm ready to get started. And so the toolkit provides activities that each agency or organization interested in using data and embedding equity can use to begin their process. Some of the activities include information on what stakeholders should be at the table. It also includes on developing a vision and mission around the work. One of the things that it really provides is a framework. The toolkit discusses a framework for organizations interested, the GARE framework, and organizations interested in understanding their organization's readiness to even begin this work. Because some people haven't even began to think through the harm that has been done in communities by governments, agencies, and the policies and decisions that they've made, the history of structural and institutional racism. And so these activities really provide that starting point or resources for those who are already moving along in their journey. Next slide, please.
So the biggest takeaway here is similar to what Leah has said and what Sue has mentioned today, is that no matter where you are, whether or not you're the data owner or you're the person that's collecting the data and working directly with young people, families, and children, that there is something that we can all do to center equity. That this is not one person's responsibility, and it must be both a top up as well as a bottom up commitment to embedding equity and power shifting with community. Next slide, please. So this one is really just a quote from the toolkit, that we are working to create a new kind of data infrastructure, and one that dismantles feedback loops of injustice and instead shares power and knowledge with those who need systems change the most. And so the next steps from this work, you can go to the next slide, is really us, the partners from the work group, going around and spreading information about this awesome toolkit in a way that other organizations can join us in this effort to embed equity. This is not a question of like if we should do it. This is a question of when and how we should do it. There's an urgency about this work that we must commit to in order to ensure that through data integration and data sharing that we are doing what's best for our communities. So I will stop here and thank you all for having me this afternoon, and then we will go on to some questions. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Bridget, Sue, Leah. That was fantastic. All right, now we're going to shift into a Q&A part of the session. We've had several really great questions come through in the Q&A box. So if you have some of those, please drop them in. I'm going to start out with a question to Sue and Bridget, because I want to make sure this is covered for folks, and it's kind of come up in the chat. Can you talk a little bit about the process of developing the toolkit and what that entailed?
Okay, so we met, AISP convened community organizers and activists, representatives from government agencies, academics, nonprofit staff. There's probably a group of 30 of us who met several times to really think through together and share experiences about what was equitable or not equitable in their community's experience, and then really begin to weave those ideas and experiences together, and came up with a framework that I think very clearly is inviting folks into the work rather than saying we figured it all out. And that's, I think, what equity really means across all sectors, right? Like no one's figured out here's what equity is. But we've done, I think, a really good job of examining what we know to be the life cycle of data and where are those places where we can grow equitable structures. I don't know, Bridget, if you want to add.
Yes. So what I wanted to also add to this is that, so when we came together last summer, the room was pretty tense because the room was pretty tense because the AISP intentionally brought together those of us who were data advocates, wanted to integrate data, wanted to move forward. And then there were some other people in the room, some other stakeholders in the room that had honestly had bad experience, and they were direct representations of communities that have been harmed by research and in the way that data has been integrated or used within governmental agencies and nonprofits. And so the fact that we literally worked together collaboratively for months to determine how can we create a toolkit that acknowledges the harm that has been done, but also provides agencies the tools and the tools necessary to not fall down similar paths as other efforts before. And so I just want to definitely put out there that the work group, the composition of the work group, it mattered who was at the table.
Excellent. And I'll just note those sessions was just a reminder for myself of how I am not conflict averse. We got lots of notices of people that were very uncomfortable. So we had to sit in the discomfort, right? Like that's one of the biggest lessons in this work. You just got to be uncomfortable and muck through the muck. So Excellent. All right. Speaking of mucking through the muck, Sue, there was a great question asking if you could talk specifically about building trust through your community participatory action research in Broward.
Yes. So a couple of things I think contributed to the building of trust between the system participants and the system professionals, as well as the researchers. One is we created an environment where people were heard and seen, where their experiences were validated, and where when their experience contradicted the expectations of the system professionals, it was not dismissed, right? And so system participants in particular, had experiences of exercising their power and not being squashed. Because what often happens in those kinds of situations is we set a table and say, yeah, we want to do this equitably. But as soon as something comes up that challenges the power structure, then we like lose our minds and shut it down. But that didn't happen. It was very skillfully facilitated to Amy's point, hold that uncomfortable truth, right? And to hold multiple truths. I think one of the keys to building trust is acknowledging that we're not trying to get to one truth, that we can hold many truths and many complexities and contradictions about our experiences, right? So we don't have to dismiss or marginalize any. I think that was a really critical piece. The other thing is that we built relationships. We learned about each other's families. We cared about each other's kids. We connected people when we had access to services or resources. I mean, we engaged with each other as friends, as neighbors, right? And that still continues to this day, right? We still have those kinds of relationships. So seeing them not as a one-off, not as a research project and we're done, but really centering that we're building relationships with people who we've not built relationships for, and we want to sustain them. Now, that's created its own tension because it takes a lot of time and energy. And one of the things about equity, and I see it in some of the questions that have come through, is how do we take the time to do the building of relationships, the listening, the honoring, the seeing, the validating, right? Because we got to be efficient and effective, we got to get results. But those results so often result in harm. And so we have to recognize that we are shifting our value system, and we have to shift the expectations and value systems of our leaders to create space for this to happen. So I don't know if that helps.
That's great. Thank you. And Sue, I think it'd be helpful too. Could you just overview the two main CPAR projects you've done in Broward?
Yeah, so we did an initial one in 2018 with young people from the juvenile justice system, the child welfare system, and the mental health system. And then for each of those, we had system professionals. And I think that's part of the innovation that we integrated into CPAR. Often it's done just with community members and then not with system professionals, but we brought them together and walked through a lot of tension because system professionals didn't always want to hear the harm that system participants were still experiencing. But we were very skillfully facilitated by the folks from the Public Science Project up in CUNY who use basically a critical race theory lens on this work. And so there is a significant power analysis that happens, and also a lot of caretaking and a lot of self-care happened through that first process. And it resulted in educational materials for families to make sure that their children didn't get caught up in a failure to appear incident with the justice system that would land them in detention for shoplifting. And so we also created a hotline for the court system, which was a significant structural change generated through this process. The second one we did in 2019, we got a grant from the Florida Institute for Child Welfare to work with young people transitioning out and parents. And we're just finishing up that project now. It has been incredibly transformative where the young people, having gone through this process, done research with their peers, with the system leaders, and interviews with parents, now are equipped to sit on advisory boards, to do training with professionals. And we are now at the cusp of bringing on youth and community organizers to further advance the advocacy within the system. So we're going to pilot a new structure of bringing community organizing into the child welfare system. So we'll circle back in a year and let you know how that's going.
Awesome. And I know lots of people are studying that. All right. We have 5 minutes left. So I want to, there's a great Q&A to remind everyone to respond to your census and to get everyone in your community to do the same. So unabashed census plug right now. Thank you for that. And then we're going to do one last question before I turn it over for a wrap up. It's a good question. It'll take us until wrap up. So I'm going to combine a couple questions. So there is a tension between outcomes and process in equity work, right? And especially now in the time of COVID, right? There's an urgency around equity and inequity and injustice that has brought things to the forefront, right? So we have this tension between process and outcomes, and then we also have this lived reality of we're in this virtual world, right? And what does that mean for folks around equity? So what are some, in 2 minutes, some big thoughts around those tensions and what you're seeing organizations do really well to manage those?
I'll go super quick. So as part of our training out into our community, we are planting the seed that equity feels different than efficiency and effectiveness, that it is going to be a different experience, and we give ourselves permission to slow down, to learn, to have a common language and a common analysis, and to build those relationships.
I can just jump in quickly. I think one of the important things I've been thinking about is just finding a way to get started now in the moment. We could all talk about the perfect process for a long time, but I think there are a lot of ways people can do small things that begin to get you on the state of practice, whether it's, taking a look at the language you're using to describe communities and how you're interpreting data. That can be step one, even if we can't do that in the full engaged way that might be ideal. So that's where I would go.
I think that what I've seen as a difference from any other time point is really organizations really interrogating their processes and really trying to, have hard conversations, really understanding where people of color in organizations have expressed many things in previous contexts, and really trying to determine how can we move forward. And so I'm going to put a plug in for the Toolkit. The Toolkit provides really a way to get, not to get in the way of perfect, right? So that don't let the way of trying to be perfect get in the way of actually doing the work. And so the Toolkit really provides a way that, one, have hard conversations if that's where you are, or two, to bring in partners that can help facilitate the process. If you don't feel comfortable, then help facilitate the process of understanding where you need to go and where you're trying to move. And so ultimately, it is important that we set in things today, we set in practices and policies that will impact and ensure equity in 2 years.
Excellent. All right. And then one last quick question, Sue. Can you tell us the name of the group from CUNY again?
Public Science Project.
Public Science Project.
I'll type it in the chat.
Great. All right. I think we have some great questions, y'all, and we will collate these, and as much as possible, we will include them in a follow-up with resources. Some of them are really easily answered with a list of resources. And we will also summarize your initial answers at the beginning of this and send them back out so you have examples of what other organizations are doing, because that's a lot of the work. It's just being inspired by either little, big, or medium-sized steps that other sites are doing. So continue the work. Thanks for joining us today. And I think I turn it over to Leah, right? Great. All right, Leah, take it away.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. As I think we posted, the slides are available on the event page, along with the links to the 2 documents we talked about. But I hope that you'll continue to engage the Urban Institute and NIP and Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy in this conversation. as Amy said, we are all learning and we're all trying to figure out the path forward. So we'd like to continue to discuss these issues moving forward. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Yeah, thanks everyone.